Planning Commission to order. Thank you all for being here. We have some guests, we have some number of staff, and some things on our agenda which have excited public interest. And so let's look at the minutes from last month. And do we have any comments or a motion to approve those minutes? Bob?
Okay.
I'll second his wave.
Okay. All those in favor of approving the minutes from last month's meeting?
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? Let me just comment on a couple things that were in those minutes. We did talk about a bit about the sewage planning and waivers and being precise with language about acceptable and not acceptable reasons for waivers. There's some more questions, I think, around sewage enforcement and how that ties in with zoning permitting. So we're going to push that to another meeting. Just wanted to make note that that's not happening tonight, but it's something that was hanging from the March meeting, as was the official map. We talked about maybe doing some more with that this month, but that's not going to happen because we've got a few other things on the agenda for tonight. We'll come back in due course. Any public comment before we go into approving tonight's agenda?
If you're a member of the public, raise your hand and I will allow you to speak. It looks like Tracy Moriarty has something she'd like to say. Tracy, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello.
Hi, Tracy.
How come every time I talk, the dogs go nuts? Okay, so I guess I have a question about, well, it's not really a question. I don't quite know what direction to take. I spoke to Chris about this, and the ordinance that was passed in reference to of course, the pervious surface was, I had asked about this a year ago before this ordinance was passed. And we talked about, in the meeting with the supervisors, I talked about the porosity or the perviousness of packed rock. So I don't know how this works to try or to alter this to make it so that we can add a perviousness to packed rock. So it gives me a little bit more of leeway with my property if I need to do something rather small. And in addition to that, did we ever talk about any kind of mitigation? Because quite frankly, my entire property actually the entire parking lot has been mitigated to the backyard to make sure our stormwater goes to the backyard. And we paid thousands of dollars to do it. And then on top of it, there's Pam's water next door that comes into my parking lot, and we're mitigating half of her stormwater as well. So who do I talk to this about? Do we look at, what do we do?
Well, the township engineer happens to be on the call tonight if he'd like to talk about the packed stone question, and Todd's also on. Todd can answer some questions as well, but maybe we'll start with Jerry, if that sounds okay to you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can do it briefly, but if we need a longer discussion with more nuance, I think we could take it outside of this meeting and have a conversation with Tracy without so many people in attendance. But that's, yeah, let's do a brief response from staff, please.
I guess my super brief response is that by code, the township looks at packed gravel as an impervious surface. It's been packed. It does not openly accept a great deal of rainwater. But for any site-specific case, what you have, we need to get it on paper. We need to look at a plan. We need to look at what you have, what you're looking to do, and make those evaluations. So shooting from the hip, I wouldn't want to go too far. So as we move forward and look at this, the impervious nature of packed gravel does not accept a great deal of rainwater in that initial abstraction.
Does it,
Still
does,
unmuted?
does that have to do with does it have to do with what's underneath that packed gravel?
It was my understanding when I was talking to Jeff Durr, and I may be speaking out of turn, but when he was speaking to me and he was speaking to you, you had mentioned something if you have any kind of perviousness in it, it would be probably 10% better than blacktop or pavement. And that's all I'm looking for. We had a problem after you passed the ordinance. I had COVID when you passed the ordinance, or when the ordinance was passed, so I did not have a chance to speak. So that's why I'm kind of backpedaling with it, because we are at our impervious surface limit. And I mean, we can certainly do things to change things coming up in the future, but if we're looking at 10% perviousness in an impervious parking lot, then that certainly would attract my attention. And in addition, I don't understand why mitigation was never addressed in this whole package with the ordinance.
Tracy, if I can suggest that perhaps we schedule a chance for you to meet with, staff and maybe a couple of members of the planning commission. We can schedule a time to chat with you about this and look at alternatives.
Perfect.
I'm confident that something can be worked out, but it sounds like we need to find a little subtlety or nuance in what's in each situation. Would that be okay with you?
That would be perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we try to schedule that in the next week to 10 days?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Any other comments from members of the public before we proceed?
Not seeing any.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. So we have an agenda that includes tonight some business that we thought might have been concluded by the Planning Commission, but the Rural Residential Zoning District and its mapping is back for a revisit by the Planning Commission per the Board of Supervisors. And we have the Kaywood North State Lots Preliminary Subdivision Plan, which we had anticipated. Staff had told us about this. So those are key agenda items. And is there any comment or motion to approve those items for tonight's agenda?
Are
Bob?
we going to be including the parks plan, or will that be deferred another month?
No, we're including that.
Okay,
We are including that as well. Yep.
okay.
So Bob.
Move
great,
to
thank you.
approve.
Second.
I'll second.
I'll second.
Great. Second. All those in favor of approving tonight's agenda? Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, staff, you want to take us into item 5A, please?
Yeah, that's the Kaywood North Estates Lots Preliminary Subdivision Plan. On January 5th of this year, staff received from Pentair Engineering a preliminary subdivision plan that proposes the creation of 13 building lots in an open space lot, meeting the requirements of the open space rural clustering regulations on the property that remained undeveloped from the Kaywood North subdivision several years ago. All lots are zoned agricultural and will be served by on-lot septic systems. Nearly all lots will be served by public water. Fire protection for most of the development will be through existing fire hydrants and one proposed hydrant, as well as either a water storage tank or fire suppression sprinkler system on the sole lot proposing access onto Linden Hall Road. And on your plan sheet, I think that's lot number 14. 3 reviews of the plan have been completed, the third of which is included with the agenda, as well as a copy of a plan sheet showing the proposal. Some work is yet to be done to gain compliance with the ordinance, but the list of deficiencies has been shortened. And it is believed that all the outstanding items can be addressed in a timely fashion. The sewage facilities planning module is still in review and must be determined to be complete by staff prior to placing the planning module on a future agenda of the Board of Supervisors. Staff's recommendation is to move to recommend to the Board of Supervisors approval of the Kaywood North Estate Lots Preliminary Subdivision Plan contingent upon satisfactory completion of all outstanding review comments.
So I have a copy of the plan, Chris, on my computer. So if you want, I can share the screen while you discuss it, if you think that would be helpful. You're muted.
Let's
And I
try
have a
that and see
paper- I have a
how,
paper copy in front of me, so I don't need it on the screen.
We do have some members of the public on the call for this item, so maybe I'll share it, and then if it's annoying, I cannot share it. How about that? So
now,
here's-
Todd, thank you for going through the the overview here. I do understand there are some things that are still to be resolved, and there are perhaps some additional questions as well. Certainly sewage management, stormwater management are really important here, as that slopes down, pretty dramatically down to Cedar Run there along the Linden Hall Road. So Amy or other staff, do you have any other or additional introductory or explanatory remarks to share?
I don't.
I don't.
Todd, how would you rate your confidence level that these issues that you say still need to be resolved are going to be resolved in a timely way?
Well, my confidence level isn't as important as the desire of the client and the client's engineer to get the plan approved. As is the case with every subdivision plan, when the Board of Supervisors grants conditional approval of a plan, which is what we anticipate this will get either at the May board meeting, or if something happens that prevents it from being on that agenda at the June board meeting. Once the board grants conditional approval at staff level, we make sure that all the conditions of approval are met before we ask the Board of Supervisors to sign the subdivision plan. So I have 100% confidence that everything will be taken care of prior to the signatures going on the plan, but it's not under my control as to when those things get done. I mean, we
Yeah,
work with Pentair
okay.
for years. John Sepp's the engineer working on this plan now. So I would anticipate that we'll get things taken care of as quickly as humanly possible.
Okay, thank you for helping kind of walk through the steps here. Planning Commission members, why don't we hear if any of you have comments, and then we might have some comments from members of the public or questions.
So I'll go ahead and start. If that's all right. This is Kent. And so I'd sent out an email with 5 questions, and hopefully I think everyone's seen the reply from Todd and Mark and Jerry. I had a question about the residue lot that's going to be kind of an open space stormwater lot, and then some of the stormwater issues themselves. There's quite a few outstanding stormwater issues, so I had some questions on that. And but there are 2 items that I want to specifically bring up tonight in my questions, and one is in regards to the having another access into Kaywood Park. And I don't know if Amy, if you can point out where I was talking about near the intersection of Montclair and Andrea, across lot 5.
I think that's right there. Yep.
Yeah, and so I'm just bringing that up because this, if we want to have a second access into the park, I mean, this would be our opportunity to do it. I haven't been to Kaywood Park for a long time, so I did drive up there today just to look at it. And I saw we have the one main access, and it looks like there might be somewhat kind of a access at the top of the hill that's not really an access. So this could be a secondary access. I think I was just talking about maybe having a 20-foot wide right away, walkway right away, that residents in this specific area it would be a shortcut for them rather than going up to the main entrance. I don't think it's super critical because it's only about another block away.
Mhm.
But if we do want to have a second access, I think this is our opportunity. Lot 5 is pretty big. I don't see why it has to have all that area. There is, and one of the replies I got is there's a drainage swale that goes down on the plan. It'd be the right side of Montclair, but there is an inlet box that's recently been installed that captures that right at that property line. So I do think that it is accessible now if we wanted to. It wouldn't be any I don't consider it would be a problem crossing that now as there was if you would have to cross a drainage swale. So I'm just throwing that out there. If we think we'd like to have a second access into it and see what the other members think. And I guess the only other issue I was going to bring up was in regards to location of street trees, but we can do that after we get through this issue.
That's fine. Let's take these one at a time then. Any other comment on the park access point that Ken has brought up?
So I'll just comment that we are adding 2 acres of parkland onto Kaywood North or onto Kaywood Park, which was the parkland requirement from Kaywood North. So the park is getting a little bigger. We did used to have access behind 2 of the properties that are adjacent to the existing park, but the Board of Supervisors, I think it was in 2006, abandoned that access and gave the land back to those 2 property owners. So there is the access off of Carmel Street into the park, and then there is a pretty decent sledding hill off of Ella into the park as well. So I don't know. I know we do have a lot of folks from the new neighborhood that are using the park now. I do hear that they seem to be enjoying the park. I don't know how big of a deal it is for them to walk on, that little bit of from Andrea on that little bit of Montclair and then down Carmel Street. I don't know if that's something the developer would consider giving a little bit of land over here on this lot 5 so that we could have a little direct access in.
Is John Sepp participating tonight?
He is. Let me hold on. John Sepp, I'm going to allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Mhm.
Yes.
Hi, Ken. I would have to discuss that issue of the access easement with my client before I would be able to commit to that. But I certainly could bring it up with him and have it, have an answer when we go to the Board of Supervisors.
If you're willing to do that, it sounds like it may be worth asking the question. They may be very happy to give that access.
So Eric Stashak, who's one of the developers, is on, and I'm going to allow him to speak. He has his hand up.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
I think we did discuss this with John. If that was necessary, we would take a little bit off of that entrance lot there that's on right. I'm not sure what number it is. John, are you there?
Yes, that's lot 5.
Didn't we discuss a little walkway from the back of lot 5? I thought that was mentioned at some point.
Yeah, when you and I were talking about, when we were asking for a waiver of the sidewalks along lots 5 through 9, we were thinking of that as a possible solution for a waiver of the sidewalks.
Oh, is that what, that's what it was about?
Yeah, but we withdrew that waiver request.
I mean, I don't see that it would be a problem if we gave I mean, 20 feet, that seems like a pretty wide sidewalk or right away through that lot. I don't,
I guess the question is, what kind of surface would the township be looking at and who would maintain it?
So if you did, like almost all of our pathways in our other parks are trail surface aggregate. And so if you were willing to do that type of a surface, which is, ADA accessible, the township can maintain it. That's actually what the pathway that we just put in Kaywood Park is. So that would tie in sort of nicely with the amenities we have in the park, and we could maintain that.
How wide, Amy?
It has to meet, and off the top of my head, Jerry, I'm looking at you, it has to meet the ADA requirements for a pathway, and I can't remember if that's 8 or 10 feet.
I believe we designed Kaywood Park at 8 feet.
8 feet.
So something in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 feet is what's being discussed here. Okay.
I mean, I'm
It sounds like
okay
there's
with that.
Go ahead, Eric.
I'm okay with
That's
an
great.
8-foot sidewalk being taken out of that lot. I mean, John, what do you think? What are your thoughts on it? Is it going to affect the lot design or the lot layout?
No, it would have a minimum effect on the lot. There would just be really the cost of installing it.
Well, personally, I think it's kind of redundant. I mean, if they walked another 50 feet, they could walk down Carmel to the park. But if it's necessary, if you'd like us to do it, we'd certainly be willing to do that.
So, well, I'm just one on the planning commission member, but and I recognize that, you're 2 lots, I don't know what that is, a few hundred feet away to Carmel, but I mean, I think it would get used by at least the residents of this subdivision, I think would use it as a shortcut. And so I do see some benefit to it myself.
I
And I
agree.
would-
And
Well, it's additional sidewalks to maintain by the township. I don't, if that's no problem with you guys, I guess we can.
No, I think if you do a trail surface aggregate, not a concrete sidewalk and not a paved surface, because that's certainly more difficult to maintain, but the trail surface aggregate works out really well for us in our parks. They're very low maintenance in terms of, annual things that we need to do. We just go in and check them every year. And that would tie in nicely with the park itself, and also give, there's a lot of young kids in Kaywood North itself, and, help those young kids get off of the street. They could ride their bike down the pathway into the main park then with their parents if they wanted to.
If it'll improve the quality of the developments and make it easier for people to access the park, then I'll agree to it. I'm sure my brother and brother-in-law will as well. 8 feet, that sounds reasonable for a sidewalk.
Yeah, that would be great, Eric, because I know we're, looking at how we're going to utilize that extra 2 acres that you guys gave us as well. So that'll be a nice enhancement for that park.
Okay, I'm okay with that.
That's great. Any other comments on this extra access? Ken, thanks for bringing it up, and John and Eric for talking through this. Any other comments on this before we move on? I think Kent, I'm hearing none, no hands.
No hands.
Ken, I think you had another issue around.
Yeah, the other
the
issue was
plantings.
on location of the street trees. I mean, I just have the one sheet 4, but it appears to me like the street trees are currently being shown in behind the sidewalk in the easement and the utility easement, soft utility easement, like for cable and electric. And and I know, trees are great, but they can also, tree roots can be an issue with everything. So trying to have trees and utilities all together could be a problem. So I was questioning maybe if the street trees should be located between the street and the sidewalk. I believe the rest of the subdivision is that way. And I don't know if there's any other conflict with doing that, of moving the street trees in between the street and the sidewalk, and then having the soft utilities located in an easement away from the sidewalk, so there's no problems with that. And that, I'm bringing that up. That was one of Jerry's comments in his review.
Well, I will say that this plan still has to go before the Shade Tree Commission. The Shade Tree Commission was on a site visit this month, so they're going to meet with the developer at their May meeting. And one of the things we've been discussing continually with the Shade Tree Commission with other developments is the tree sidewalk conflict and how we can minimize that, because certainly the sidewalks in the village of Bollesburg are a great example of what happens when your trees are planted right on top of your sidewalks and then you end up replacing them. I know in Liberty Hill, we actually had root guards that were planted with all of the street trees, and that's something we've discussed having done now being a standard when you plant trees, because that forces the roots to go down. And also planting on the back side of the sidewalk does also help, because the roots will go towards where there's more room. So they're going to go back further into the yard. We've been working with the Borough of State College and some of the other municipalities around here and discussing this. So we have been looking at how we can do things to minimize that conflict.
But it sounds like the plan as proposed does not meet sort of either the latest thinking or this conflict that Kent has broached.
Well, the plan is designed as Amy had described it, with the sidewalk first and then the trees behind it. The issue we have with this development, as opposed to the last phases, there's more topography on these lots. And we have to grade a swale in on the upper side. It's more of an issue on the upper side, and the swales would have to be tied in. So we have to grade it that the driveways aren't so steep, and then, we have to take all into account. And given the topography, the best place for the sidewalks would be up against the swales with the trees behind it. Now, we do have a 15-foot easement. The sidewalk would be 2 feet off the right of way. It'd be a 4-foot sidewalk, which leaves a 9-foot width to put the trees in. So the trees could be planted, if they were centered in that section, the tree would be 4.5 feet behind the sidewalk. They could even be a little further back, because we still have another 4.5 feet to plant them. So the trees will not be right up against the sidewalks. And I know one of Jerry's comments was to take into consideration where the transformers would be located. And I think I was planning on contacting Jerry and Tony West from Allegheny Power to have a Zoom meeting just to decide where we would locate the transformers in relation to the sidewalk and the trees.
What about the underground utilities in relation to the tree roots?
That's what we're going to be. That was really Jerry's comment, is where they would be in relation to the trees. And either they would be under the sidewalk or between the sidewalk and the right of way. And that's something we have to work out with Tony West. So the bottom line is we have sidewalks, underground utilities, and trees that we have to get. We've given a 15-foot swath to put those in, which is wider than typically seen. But I'm sure between Jerry, Tony West, and I, we could tweak that to make it all work.
And it sounds like the possibility of putting, as I hear you say, the utilities under the sidewalk or even closer to between the sidewalk and the street.
That's correct. And we are going to grade that whole 15-foot easement with the road grading. So that'll all be brought to grade when the road's put in. We're not going to leave that for the lot owners to grade, because we don't want to have a situation where somebody buys a house and they go to develop their lot and the utilities, the electric lines aren't deep enough and the trees don't work and the sidewalk doesn't work. So that'll all be graded out with the plan regardless of whatever geometry we come up with. And that's been noted on the plan.
Okay.
Kent, do you have any other
Those were
comments or
my
questions?
major comments. You know, the other was in regards to, I do feel that there's significant stormwater issues unresolved, but that'll between Pantera and Jerry to work out.
Right. Okay. Any other comments on this state law preliminary subdivision plan from planning commission members or members of the public?
It looks like Rich Manning has a question.
Yeah,
Rich?
I was just wondering if there was any thought given to providing a bike connection down to Linden Hall Road, since that is a Pennsylvania Bicycle Route G. Is there any thought to giving an easement or some other connective route down to there?
There has not been.
What's the distance? What would the distance be from hard surface down to Linden Hall Road approximately?
About 500 feet.
Hmm.
What would be involved?
Well, at a minimum, providing an easement to allow that to happen if it didn't happen with this plan. But again, you know, whatever type of hard packed surface to provide a connection down to the bike route.
I'm not familiar with the bike routes around that area. I don't know where they run. So does it run down Route 45?
No, this runs from New York to West Virginia, and it uses this part of Linden Hall Road as part of it, and then it goes up out through Center Hall and takes 192. But it's a Pennsylvania state bike route, and reasonably heavily traveled, and provide a connection that people would not have to go out onto Route 45 and around to get to the bike route from this area.
I would have to discuss that with John. I'm really not familiar with the bike routes at all. So there would be people crossing through Kaywood from Route 45 to Linden Hall Road. Is that?
It would just provide a connection point to the bike route from this area.
You know, all of Kaywood.
Obviously, you know, we haven't looked into this. I know we have the detention basin berm. We would have, you'd be going down a berm from the basin. Rich, I don't know I imagine you could make something work there, but I couldn't commit to that tonight.
Could you check to see what the average slope of such a bikeway would be across?
Yeah.
I guess we're talking about going through lot 14. I don't know. Or are we talking about going down the other access?
You'd have to go down the other access.
Okay. Yeah, if you could look and see what the average slope would be of that.
Yeah, I had to check that out because it does get steeper as you get toward Linden Hall Road.
I think it's a laudable idea. I mean, I don't know, again, if it's practical and reasonable, it sounds like a great idea to connect because it is just fabulous bicycling along Linden Hall Road, and to give access to people, I think it's a worthy exploration. But I don't know how, how much that would impact, advancing plans. So that's out of my depth. Someone else would have to comment on that.
I really have no comment because I really don't know what the legalities of a bicycle path going through a private
Sure.
property are. I don't know. I'll have to talk to John and my brother and my brother-in-law about this.
Okay.
I don't have enough information to comment on it.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you. Thanks for even thinking about having the conversation about it. If it's something that can be done without, jumping through a ton of hoops and doing a whole bunch of workaround, looks like there's some upsides to at least exploring it.
Okay.
Amy, do you have any suggestions on how to proceed here, and just in terms of the approval of the plan, or pending some of these conversations?
Well, I would say that the bike idea is great. The bike connection is great, but that's not something that we can deny or approve or deny a plan over. We can't hold that up.
Okay.
I would say that it appears the motion from staff is to recommend approval of this preliminary plan contingent upon the satisfactory completion of all the outstanding review comments. I think there are some things that they do need to take care of, and they, like I said, they do also have to need to meet with the Shade Tree Commission. So I would recommend that you follow staff's recommendation tonight so that they can
Yep.
move forward.
Yep. Any other comments from Planning Commission members or members of the public? Do I hear a motion to recommend to the Board of Supervisors the approval of this plan? Thank you, Bob. Second, Bill, thank you. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Just one thing,
Yeah,
do we have
Bob.
to make, as part of that motion, do we have to include the easement for the second entrance? No, okay,
Now, we've noted that as part of the minutes, and we'll work on that.
very good, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Good conversation. Let's move on to agenda item B of new business update to the Parks Plan.
So the township adopted a parks plan in 2012. The plan includes information on each of the township's parks and identifies future needs and challenges. When we receive parkland fee in lieu money, we use the park plan as the basis to decide how we're going to spend that money. And the state says that we can spend it anywhere in the township as long as we have a park plan that identifies future needs. We're updating the plan for 2021 to include our newest park, which is Tussey Pond Park, which is up off of Discovery Drive near Calvary Baptist Church. We also are suggesting that the Diamond, which has sort of been our little orphan in the township, be moved under the purview of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. They've sort of been the ones that have been caretaking the plantings and the planters. And they would be interested in formalizing that relationship just so they can have some ownership of the Diamond, and we can make sure that the Diamond's needs are being met. Last time when we adopted this plan, it went through the Planning Commission, so we just wanted to bring it back for you guys again, have you take a look at it, and if you feel it's ready, give your blessing so that we can move it on to the board for their approval next month.
Are there any members of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee here?
We have two members of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee here, Jenny Evans and Susan Hammerstead, and I'm not sure if they want to say anything, but if they raise their electronic hand, I can unmute them. I'm not seeing that they are.
Well, thank you for coming to the meeting, and thank you for putting this plan together. It's great to see the inventory of parks and the capital needs and a little bit of interpretation to the parks as well. And George, thanks for pointing out that we had dropped a page in the packet that was at least mailed. Any comments from Planning Commission members?
I have a question. First, I'll comment, I really like the idea of the planters being included in the parks purview. I think it's a good sort of extension of the kind of thinking and work that's done on the park committee. So thank you for being willing to adopt that space. I know it has been had mixed reviews as a pollinator garden. But I'm glad to see that there's some sort of thinking about that happening. You may know that I served on the park committee. And so my question has to do with the Yoder projects, which the pavilion or the amphitheater that has been a part of that plan. I just wonder if that is going to see the light of day, and what I was encouraged to see that it actually made it onto this document, but I'd like to know if that project is moving forward and if there's anything that we need to be doing to help whatever's happening there.
So last year, before COVID, I told the Parks Committee that 2020 was going to be the year of the Parks Committee because we had all these great projects we were going to do. And then COVID happened and sort of took all the wind out of our sails. So we are moving forward this year with getting the amphitheater project done at the Yoder Preserve. I know that's one of the things I'm working with Jerry to finish up with the Public Works crew, some grading there, so that we can get that done. We have some other improvements. We're redoing Nittany View Park this year, which we're very excited about. That's actually going to be happening early summer. We're going to be doing some improvements to Harpster Park, and then also starting work on Tussey Pond Park. It's our only park with a pond, and 2 to 3 acre pond, and we're going to hopefully get some grant funding to put in some fishing piers. So we are going to be moving some long-term projects forward this year, including that amphitheater, which we think is going to be a really neat feature for the preserve, because there's a lot of people that go out there, birders and other groups go out there and use the preserve. So we're kind of excited to get a formal spot for them.
Great, thank you. The other comment that I'd make is I know that Mole Mansion property is doing a lot with trail building and bridge. There's now a bridge that connects to Blue Spring. And I just wonder if there is some coordination or at least conversations happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Bob Cameron has been a wonderful friend to the township, and he has actually reached out to us, and we're looking at doing maybe some signage. Those trails are not ADA accessible, so we need to, from this township standpoint, make sure that folks know they're not ADA accessible. But we're actually going on our parks tour tomorrow before the weather gets bad, and we're going to be up at Blue Spring and hopefully looking at some of those trails. I know a couple of the folks on the committee have actually walked them, so we're very fortunate that Bob is doing such wonderful work over at the Mansion to connect our park.
Thank you.
Amy, thanks for those comments and good points. I recently, my wife and I recently walked the trails, all of them around the Bowl Mansion, and they're wonderful. And the connectivity to Blue Spring Park is really great. So what a great cooperative venture with municipal government and this private nonprofit. Other questions or comments on the parks plan? Okay, do we have a motion to forward this plan to the Board of Supervisors?
I'll move that.
And I'll second it.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Amy. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We're back to rural residential zoning. And before, I know we have some discussion here, and I will just say, Amy and staff, thank you for directing our attention to work that predates most of the people on this meeting. the rural areas, designated rural areas project that wrapped up 6 years ago, and is the genesis for some of the thinking around here. I think it's just a smart starting point, and thank you for bringing our attention back to sort of the basis of what this, how this opened up today's present issues and plans. Staff, you want to talk us through what we've got going here, please?
Yeah, and Mark, I'm going to jump in right before you start. I just want to go over what happened at the board meeting in terms of the motion that the Board of Supervisors made, which I emailed out to all of you, so you sort of understand the starting point for our discussion tonight. And I will actually just read it so you know. It was by Supervisor Graham to send this back to the Planning Commission to look at the zoning map and the boundary. The motion was seconded by Supervisor Wilson. Supervisor Harden made an amendment to the motion and asked that when we send it back, that we want that the property looked at, we want that property looked at to see if it could be ag, but we also want the Planning Commission to look at the other properties that are changing to make sure we agree. Supervisor Graham agreed to the amendment. There was a comment that we want the Planning Commission to look at the criteria we use to create the map and to look at the map and make sure it was applied correctly. Supervisor Lord said it was important that the Planning Commission share how they develop the criteria, and that motion was approved unanimously. So tonight, Mark's going to walk you through a presentation. Tonight we're proposing, because this is a big item to look at. So we're proposing that we let's start with going back, giving you some history, because Bob Igo and Jeff Durr are the last two men standing from the Planning Commission of long ago when we did this. And also let's go through the criteria and the methodology. And if you concur with the criteria and the methodology tonight, one of the suggestions that was made was that we put that actually in, we do a statement of policy in the preamble to the ordinance. So that would lay out that criteria, because we want to guard against being accused of possibly spot zoning. So tonight we're focusing on, Mark's presentation is going to focus just on that criteria, a little bit of the history of the project. And then if you guys are okay with the criteria, next month, we're going to look at the map. We're going to sit down and start looking at probably rural residential and ag are the two big ones. So we'll probably start with those boundaries and look at them. I'm not sure if rural centers and natural areas are certainly not getting the press the other two districts are getting right now, but I'm not sure that they actually need to be looked at in depth, but we can look at everything. So, and the supervisors know this is, we're going to do our due diligence with this. I think it's a good exercise to make sure we're all still on board with everything and that everything is zoned appropriately moving forward. So with that, I will be quiet, and Mark, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Let me get this set up right. So as Amy indicated, I'm going to be providing the Planning Commission with an overview of the planning that went into the proposed rural rezoning update. So this goes, as Amy mentioned, it goes back a number of years. We only have Bob Igo and Jeff Durr, the only two remaining Planning Commission members from that time. From the board's perspective, 3 of the members of the board were present when this was done. And actually, Frank Harden would be the 4th member. He was on the Planning Commission at the time this project was finished and forwarded on to the Board of Supervisors. So it's probably important that everyone kind of be brought up to speed on how everything was done during this planning process and how it got us to the point where we're at today. What I'm going to do, for those of you who were in attendance at the March 24th board meeting, I'm going to be going through a couple slides, and then I'm going to stop with a question slide and give an opportunity for the Planning Commission to ask any questions you might have of me before I move on. I think it's probably just easier to take it in chunks than to give you all however many slides I have put together, because there's quite a number of them. But and then once we're done with that, there's an opportunity then obviously for you to discuss more and to take any public comments. So just to give you a little bit of background here. So the presentation tonight, again, it's going to focus on planning that was done by the township and not so much on the zoning regulations that were developed from the planning that was done. Harris Township, we rely on the Center Region Comprehensive Plan to give us overall planning guidance. The picture here on the left is actually the future land use map, or at least a portion of it,
of Harris Township that was in the 2013 comprehensive plan that Harris Township is signatory to. In addition to the comprehensive plan, municipalities are certainly allowed to conduct additional planning as necessary, as long as it's consistent with the comprehensive plan. And I think there's a number of examples in Harris Township. We had the small area plan. We had this designated rural areas report, as well as the residential review that we're currently working through. So ultimately, our zoning regulations are a tool that are used to implement our planning, our comprehensive plan, as well as any more specific plans that we might come up with. And in the end, those zoning regulations should be consistent with the planning that was completed. And so in the end, there should be some type of a logical nexus between the existing or the zoning that we have and the plans that we've adopted. It shouldn't be arbitrary. So if someone comes in and says they want their land to be zoned commercial and all of our planning shows that an area should be residential, it would be quite arbitrary and against the nature of the planning that the community has done to zone it differently than what it was intended to be. And that's obviously a very extreme example, but it's something that we need to be thinking about whenever we talk about zoning and how we are given the opportunity to use it through the municipality's planning code. So my goals tonight are to provide an overview of the designated rural areas project and the methodology that was used by the Planning Commission to complete this report. I'm also going to provide an overview of the Yoakum properties and their inclusion in the RR area. And then finally, I'm going to discuss a couple potential paths forward based upon the Board of Supervisors request. So does anyone on the Planning Commission have any questions for me before I get started on what my goal is here as far as conveying this information to you this evening?
Mark, how often does the Center Region Comprehensive Plan, how often is that revised?
Every 10 years. So we are currently in the process of getting ready to do another update. So you'll probably start seeing revisions to the comprehensive plan here in the next couple of years coming forward to the Planning Commission for your review.
So is there any validity to the idea that the comprehensive plan is sufficiently out of date that we should be, no longer following it to the letter or the intent?
No, I think that, when we write a comprehensive plan, it's a pretty detailed and lengthy process, and we're trying to look ahead 20 to 30 years. I think if we were in a place where change was so chaotic that we weren't able to keep up, we would certainly just update the plan more often. But in this case, I think for our community and the way we've handled things, both at the big picture level, because remember the comp plan from the center region is a big picture of the whole region. Harris Township's a perfect example. If we've taken it upon ourselves to be more specific in certain areas where we felt that specificity was needed.
So
Mark,
follow along with the idea of what the center region plan had in mind 7 years ago for the zoning that we're looking at massaging for our next 20 years, perhaps, is still a strong argument for the work we've done.
Sure. Yeah. What has been done by the Planning Commission and the board over the last couple of years is definitely still consistent with what the comp plan is recommending for the future of the region in general.
All right.
Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, could I jump in? This was almost done in parallel with the comp plan. Just as a historical perspective, we were doing a review of the various zoning districts within the township, and we were doing them on we'd split up into small groups, and we were looking at them, and it kind of became apparent that we weren't working in concert as a whole, and we decided that we needed something that was more comprehensive and more strategic, I would say. And this aligned with the center region comprehensive plan. So the two of them kind of came together at the same time. So it's not a matter of us taking direction from the center region. It's a matter of the two of them came together roughly at the same time. So.
Okay.
I read over several years worth of meeting minutes to try to capture what Bob just nicely said. I should have just called Bob because I didn't remember all those details. That was very helpful. So if there's no other questions,
Mark, do you want me to, I mean, just, I don't want to take over, but do you want me to, from my notes, say what some of the, offer what some, the planning commission had to think about at that time, what our
Well,
concerns were? Or
if
do
you
get
don't
it?
mind, I think a couple of my next slides might cover that. And then when
Okay.
we get through that, maybe you can kind of add on some additional.
That's fine. I don't want to get in the way.
Oh, no, you're good. Appreciate it. All right. So as Bob mentioned, back in 2012 and 2013, the Planning Commission began a general evaluation of all of the township's zoning districts. And as Bob said, this was during the same time that the comp plan was being worked on. There were a couple other things that happened during this time as well that kind of all converged right around at the same point. So this project in the end spawned numerous planning efforts, including this designated rural areas project, the small area plan, and the residential zoning update. During this process, this review, we also held a number of meetings with the farming community to try to get some feedback from them to find out how things were changing in the agricultural industry and maybe how our ordinances needed to be updated. The ordinances that are in place right now, for the most part, were all adopted in the late 1970s. So needless to say, there's been a lot of changes that have taken place in the township as far as development is concerned. And I think part of this review recognized that we needed to update a number of our regulations to try to match how the township has grown. The other thing is that the review did identify a number of core concerns and issues specifically for the rural areas. For example, some of the uses that are permitted in our rural areas were inconsistent with the intent of the districts themselves. Based on our meetings with the farming community, farmers said they felt like they would benefit from having some more flexibility to sell products on site. They also said they would love to have neighbors who understood what it meant to live next to a farm, but that's not something we can really address through regulations. Horticulture should be allowed on smaller lots. And then also that farmland and open space are being lost primarily to residential and non-agricultural development. So this review was completed right around end of 2013. And it had a lot of kind of just generic comments on some of the regulations and also some very specific recommendations for how districts should maybe be updated. And then in late 2013, the commission reviewed a report that was completed by the Center Regional Planning Agency that specifically analyzed all of the Center Region's rural zoning districts to see if they were consistent or inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. And this analysis made numerous recommendations regarding the Harris Township regulations that the Planning Commission reviewed, I think, and really took to heart. At the same time, we also had the comprehensive plan being adopted in late 2013, and that provided a number of new goals and policies for the rural areas, both here in the township as well as region-wide. And we also had a situation where Calvary Baptist Church had requested an expansion of the growth boundary in our rural areas to build a large church facility that I don't think a lot of planning commissioners had ever envisioned would be built in a rural area due to its size and the need for public services. So a couple of things kind of all converged at the end of 2013 in addition to that report that was done by the commission. And they decided as a group that there should probably be a long-range plan developed for the township's rural areas before changing zoning regulations. They didn't feel like the zoning regulation recommendations they had were enough. And they wanted to go deeper and do more long-range planning. So one of our planning commission members at that time did a little bit of research and recommended utilizing a planning process that was conducted down in Lancaster County. And I think we may have just simply stolen the name. I believe it was called a Designated Rural Areas Project. And the commission talked about it, and they agreed that this was something they'd want to do for Harris Township's rural areas and developed a similar methodology to do so. So the Designated Rural Areas Project was then discussed with the board in January 2014, and the study was included on the Planning Commission's work program. So the intent of the Designated Rural Areas Project was to provide a detailed plan for all of the township's rural areas that would be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And I think one of the key aspects of this study was is it wasn't about how to change our existing zoning. They didn't sit down and say, let's look at our existing districts and figure out where districts should move and should we make new districts. It was literally looking at the township's rural areas as generally just a blank slate from a zoning perspective and saying, what do we have as far as land uses are concerned? And what type of regulations would we want to have and what type of uses would we want to allow? Ultimately, the goal was to identify areas that could be designated for natural uses and protected lands, areas that could be designated that would be primarily focused on agriculture, and then also areas that consisted largely of rural residential development. The Planning Commission also had set out a couple questions they wanted to answer, and those were, where do we want to see future residential growth? Where do we want to see future non-residential growth? How do we limit the scale of that future non-residential growth, which again, I think came back to the Calvary issue. And then finally, are there any uses that we currently allow in our rural areas that we shouldn't be allowing for? I know that that was something that came out of the earlier review. We allow a lot of uses in our rural commercial district, and I think there were just concerns about certain uses being established in places where they probably don't belong. And then to that end, are there any ways we could try to pursue intergovernmental agreements to cooperate with neighboring municipalities? So the methodology that the Planning Commission settled on was, again, they were not going to study the locations of the existing zoning districts or the uses they allowed, and they were going to focus this just on the entire rural areas of the township. The commission identified designated rural areas and answered some key questions by evaluating the location of existing natural and environmental features. They also looked at development patterns, both inside and outside of the regional growth boundary and sewer service area. And they also discussed existing uses and uses that should not be permitted or should be permitted in our rural areas. So with that, I will take another break here and see. Went a little past the overview of how we got to where we are in doing the project, Bob, but if anyone has any comments or questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Mark, could you back up one slide for me, please? Thank you. Bob, I'd appreciate any overview you've got, because I came in very shortly after all this was discussed, and there was a certain institutional memory the rest of you guys had that I did not at the time. So
I think a lot of our concern, if this is a good time to talk about that, Chris, Amy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think the Planning Commission was concerned about, there was a big concern about making sure that two things, that we preserved agricultural land for agricultural purposes, but we also gave farmers the opportunity to develop their property in ways that would be sustainable, okay, for both community and provide them with a legacy of income if they want it. And so that was kind of the overriding perspective, I think, that we had in this and this whole project. I think Mark hit on a lot of the really good points that were part of it. The conservation, obviously, the conservation of natural resources, the options for the farmers. One ironic thing here is that we're talking about spot zoning as a potential issue. As I look through my notes from that period of time, what we wanted to do was try to make sure we didn't get into spot zoning issues. So that there's some irony in there. It's promote growth. Yeah, really. So, but I think Mark really did a fine job of it. And my notes are really consistent with what Mark's saying, so I'm good with it. If anybody, you have any specific questions, be happy to answer them. I think it was a good piece of planning, quite honestly. I think it was innovative. I think what the planning commission did along with Amy and Todd and Mark and looking at what we did, I think it was it was really, really good. I've talked to other people in other areas about it. They're kind of surprised with it, and they were complimentary with it about it. So,
Bob, have the activities, potential activities that can go on farms in you know, has it changed so much that you know, you guys missed stuff? Or, I mean, this whole thing seems to me like somebody literally asking for a spot zoning simply because it fits their future needs or desires, as opposed to staying within the comprehensive plan that was put together in the first place. And I understand how these things creep up on people who are not sitting in meetings once a month discussing it endlessly. You know, I remember the comment being made when I was watching the supervisors meeting, that this seemed to, you know, come out of nowhere to the individuals who are requesting stuff. And I guess we just, because we're involved in it, we're taking for granted that people understand that the work is being done. I mean, it is what they're asking for something that nobody would have thought would have been included in this 6 years ago, 5 years ago?
well, I think we want to maybe finish up. I mean, that's getting a little off the subject here, Bill,
Yeah.
and into the weeds. We talk about that later, but I think that what we did was good. I think that we were we were proactive and foresighted in what we did. We talked to a bunch of people, so I think what we did was good. I stand by that comment.
Well, is it just something that nobody would have expected, you know?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, and I think we are going to get to that. I think we are going to get to the crux of things eventually, Bill. But I think, Mark, if you have more, are you going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the criteria?
I do. I have
this-
a lot more detail. Yes.
Yeah,
So-
okay.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm going to be going through, and I'll have multiple kind of stops where I'll provide opportunities for questions and comments. But I am going to walk through the kind of more detail in the methodology and how all the areas were ultimately delineated. So hopefully that'll provide you with the context that you need. So as I mentioned earlier here about the resources, so the Planning Commission started out by looking at all of the natural and environmental features that exist in the township's rural areas. And this is a list here on the right-hand side that is more or less summarizing the majority of what's shown on these maps. I think there may have been a couple additional maps that were created that maybe didn't have quite as much detail shown on them. But really, you know, the Township Planning Commission looked at slopes. They looked at the different types of soils that exist. They even considered the natural heritage inventory that the county had completed, which we do have two areas that are identified as potentially having natural heritage plants. Looked at, you know, state and municipally owned lands, well fields, different stream types, perennial, intermittent, high quality. Also examined locations of floodplains, water bodies, wetlands, and riparian buffers. So this was the focus of the Planning Commission in terms of what type of natural and environmental features do we have, you know, and where is farming going to be most supported. Looking at the yellow areas there on this map are the prime agricultural soils, the bottom map on the left. The Planning Commission, from the natural resource or the resource evaluation, found that water resources that we have in our rural areas are largely protected through our riparian buffer and floodplain regulations. There are areas that are comprised of steep slopes, and these areas tend to have higher concentrations of natural and environmental resources that should probably be protected from development. There are some unique resources such as those in the Natural Heritage Inventory that would be difficult to protect. Prime agricultural soils and other resources of slopes less than 15% are most likely to be impacted by non-agricultural development. And then we also had the State College Borough Water Authority Executive Director come and visit with the Planning Commission to provide some input on how zoning should be structured to help protect the well fields in the western part of the township. So after the resource evaluation, or at least as part of this, I don't know that I think these were kind of talked about synonymously back and forth. The Planning Commission also looked at land uses in the rural areas. And for the most part, our land uses are pretty simple. We don't have a lot beyond residential and agricultural. There's probably a handful of non-residential uses that are located here and there, but for the most, non-agricultural and non-residential uses, like there's a church in Linden Hall, for example. But for the most part, they focused a lot on where our residential development had occurred in the township over the last 30 or so years since the zoning ordinance had been adopted in the late 1970s. In particular, they looked at lots that are less than 10 acres in size and therefore unable to be used for agricultural uses. And those properties are shown as yellow on the map here on the left. They also examined where we've had lots that were established through the township's open space rural clustering regulations, as those were adopted in the early 1990s or mid 90s. I'm not quite certain on the exact date, but those are a different style of development that requires some preservation of open space. So from the land use evaluation, the Planning Commission found that there are several locations within the township's rural areas that primarily consist of large lot residential development. And when we're talking about this type of large lot residential development outside of the regional growth boundary, it's mostly in the areas around Linden Hall, Shingletown, Windmill Road, Bailey Lane, and Crestview Avenue. The majority of the rural areas within the regional growth boundary have been developed with large lot residential uses, several of which were established through the open space rural clustering regulations. I think looking back on the maps, there's only maybe one property in the growth boundary and sewer service area that hasn't been in some way subdivided or developed, and that is a little triangular shaped piece of property that is off of Bear Meadows Road right below, and actually I'll just see if I can't pull that up. I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but it's right down here as on the way up to Tussey. There is a little triangular shaped piece below Bear Meadows Village that actually is a larger piece. It's not a property by itself. It actually belongs to a property to the east of that. That's, I believe, probably close to 100 acres in size. So for the most part, everything within the growth boundary that is located in our rural districts has been developed for agricultural uses. And then there are some residential development at suburban densities in Linden Hall and Shingletown areas. These clearly predate the enactment of zoning for the most part. A lot of those lots were created probably in the 1800s. And existing and future agricultural uses are most likely to exist in areas that are not comprised of large lot residential development or concentrated natural and environmental features. So really, I think when the Planning Commission looked at this, it was the idea that where we're going to have the majority of ag uses in the future is going to be away from these residential, large lot residential areas and not on our steep slopes where it would be difficult to farm. So those were the key findings from the land use section. Does anyone have any questions for me before I move on to talking a little more about the different areas that were delineated? Okay, not hearing any, I will move along. So the next step that the Planning Commission took was to go about defining the different areas that we talked about early on as part of the intent of this project. So using the land use and the resource analysis, the Planning Commission first looked at creating an area that included the highest concentrations of natural and environmental resources. So this is our areas where we have steep slopes with a lot of seeps and springs and other features that would be difficult to develop. The Planning Commission also tried to create additional areas where similar land uses and development types are grouped together where possible. Typically, whenever you're looking at again, a piece of, or an area of a community that you're not considering the existing zoning and you're trying to create a new zoning boundary or potentially a new zoning boundary, you want to put similar uses together as much as possible, just because that creates more continuity than moving forward. And then the Planning Commission, after defining these areas, worked on creating an intent and purpose for each one, as well as a list of some appropriate uses that could be conducted in each of these areas. So the first area I'm going to talk a little bit about is the designated natural area. This is the area that is basically where all of our steep slopes are located. The Commission utilized a lot of topographic contour data that we provided to delineate the boundaries of the district. It includes a lot of the state forest land, some water authority properties, and recreational areas such as Tussey Mountain. Basically, the Planning Commission felt that these areas shouldn't be really utilized for very much development due to the natural features, and recommended that we have development standards that would strictly protect those different resources that exist there. In terms of acceptable uses for the natural areas, the Planning Commission identified that agriculture could still be done there, as well as a related dwelling. Parks, conservation of the land, well sites, camps and camping grounds, and forest and game lands were some of the uses that they provided as examples. The next area that was identified was designated agricultural area. And this generally includes areas with low development densities that can support agricultural uses. So these are areas that aren't really developed with a lot of residential use lots at this point. There might be some here and there, but for the most part, it's still very open and has large open space capable of being used for agriculture. This area, the Planning Commission did note, it's a big chunk of the township, and it includes a lot of natural resources that they felt should be protected if the land is developed with residential uses. I think as a result of this, the Planning Commission didn't really feel that our current open space rural clustering ordinance is protecting a lot of these uses or ensuring that the open space land contains these valuable resources. So that was one of the recommendations that they ultimately had about this area. So some of the acceptable uses that the Planning Commission identified was again, agriculture and related dwellings, agriculture related uses such as agritourism, limited agricultural retail, landscape contractor businesses, and farm wineries. They recommended other open space uses, public and institutional uses, some limited commercial uses that are consistent with a rural area, such as a veterinary office and dog training facilities. And then finally, as I mentioned, they felt that single family residential dwellings would be fine within this area of the township, so long as it was subjected to some new criteria known as conservation design criteria, which is based on some models that are nationally known for protecting farmland. Conservation design, just as a reminder, it seeks to protect natural resources on property while still allowing for residential development. And the Planning Commission, I think, felt that this was probably the most appropriate way to allow for development of residential uses in this agricultural area. And actually, the second bullet here is a direct quote from the final report, which was that these conservation design criteria will help ensure that agricultural and open space resources are preserved for future generations while allowing for residential development that is compatible with the township's long-range growth strategies. So that was the reason behind recommending a new residential development tool for this agricultural area that was identified. The next area that the Planning Commission identified was the rural residential area. And this is an area that's primarily comprised of large lot residential uses. The majority of the area is unlikely to be used for agricultural purposes in the future, just strictly due to the fact that it is largely developed with residential uses. There are a few properties that can and probably will be farmed for the long term, but for the most part, if you look at a zoning or a land use map of these areas, there's an awful lot of residential in these areas in particular. And this includes large lot residential developments within the regional growth boundaries, such as the Rocky Ridge development, Aspen Heights, Hunt Ridge Manor, and Laurel Hills. Acceptable uses that the Planning Commission had identified was agriculture and related dwellings, parks and recreational areas, conservation of the land, religious uses, and single-family residential dwellings at a density of 1 dwelling unit per acre, except within the regional growth boundary where it can be a little higher due to the fact that they have public sewer. So as I mentioned, the developments, we have a number of these areas of the rural residential area that are a number of properties that were developed using the open space rural clustering regulations. These regulations currently apply to all residential development in rural districts on parcels of 10 acres or more. And it requires that 50% of the land area be set aside as open space. So, and again, if you're in the growth boundary, like Rocky Farm's a perfect example, they're allowed to have a higher density because of the fact that they're in the regional growth boundary and have public sewer. The majority of these types of developments were included in the rural residential area, including 3 in particular within the regional growth boundary. I think there's actually maybe more than 3, but there's 3 large ones that were in the growth boundary. But there's definitely the majority of these open space developments are in this rural residential area. These open space lots, so again, you have to have 50% open space, the other 50% can be developed with residential uses. The 50% that's an open space lot, the uses of that open space lot are quite limited. And this list here gives, this is the exhaustive list from the ordinance. So anytime you have an open space lot that was created through these regulations, these are the only uses you're allowed to do on those. It's public park and recreational uses, basically farming as is currently allowed in our agricultural district. That does include the sale of items produced on site in as long as it's consistent with the Pennsylvania right to farm law. And then conservation of the land and potable water well and sewage treatment areas for the residential portion of the development. And then the final area that was identified, and it might be difficult to see on this map, that's the little blue areas around Lindenhall and Shingletown, is the rural centers area. And these are the areas that are primarily developed at non-rural densities and were done so prior to the enactment of zoning. So there's very little development potential in these in the rural centers area. And the Planning Commission felt that some of the acceptable uses could include single family detached dwellings, religious uses and community centers, parks and rec, schools and child care centers and well facilities. So in general, this would be very similar or was envisioned to be very similar to our existing single family residential district in terms of the uses that it would be allowed to support. So in the end, the designated rural areas report was completed and presented to the Board of Supervisors in September of 2015. The report provides a general overview of all the township's rural areas and a recommended regulatory strategy to develop updated zoning districts. And the Board of Supervisors asked the Planning Commission, when this was presented to them, to move forward with preparing new zoning districts and regulations based on the findings of the report. So that was probably my longest section. So I'd be happy to go ahead and answer any questions that you might have about the different areas that the Planning Commission identified.
Chris, we have a question from the public. Do you want to wait till the end?
Mark, what are your additional chapter headings with your presentation?
I think the next section I'm going to be talking about the Yoakum properties in particular, since that was how this request was sent back to the Planning Commission. And then I think I just have one final section where there's kind of a wrap up of some recommendations.
Yeah, so if it's okay, Amy, with you and our questioner from the public, unless there's a time constraint of some kind, let's go ahead and move through the rest of the presentation and then open it up for questions.
Okay.
Mark, I have a point to just emphasize, and that is in your rural residential area, one of the several permitted uses is pretty much full-on agricultural uses, raising of crops, raising of livestock, horticultural uses. So that's noteworthy for us to put a pin in as we move forward with the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think the planning commission at that time didn't feel like agriculture shouldn't be allowed there. They just didn't feel that it was going to be the most common use in the area because most of it has been developed for residential homes, but they still
Yeah.
felt that agriculture should be supported there. And so it was a permitted use.
And that was the use of that land for many, many years prior to residential development in most cases, not all, but in most cases.
Correct.
Yep, okay.
All right, well, if there's no other questions from the planning commission, I'll move along then and talk briefly about the Yoakum properties. As some of you may not have been in attendance when I discussed some of this at the March 24th board meeting. So this is just an overall location map showing the location of some of the subdivisions that are located within the regional growth boundary that are currently in the agricultural zoning district. So we have the Rocky Farm, Aspen Heights, Hunt Ridge Manor. Kissel is the original name of the development that Mr. Yoakum now owns, and then Laurel Hills and Bear Meadows. And those are some good examples of the large lot residential subdivisions that were created inside of the growth boundary in our current agricultural zoning district. Mr. Yoakum's properties in particular, they were subdivided by the previous owners back in 2001, utilizing the open space rural clustering regulations. And so you have a 17.4 acre open space lot that again would be restricted to the uses that are outlined in our zoning ordinance. Then you also have two residential lots, one that's 5.3 acres and one that's 3.4 acres. Although I think it says 3.3 on the map, so might be off slightly on that. The plan notes on the zoning or on the original subdivision plan state that these lots may not be further subdivided and that the use of the open space lot must comply with the township's regulations. And access to these lots provided via Nittany Meadow Farm Lane, which is a private street. And the subdivision plan also specifically prohibits access from these properties directly onto 322. These properties were added to the regional growth boundary and sewer service area in the mid-1990s when Hunt Ridge Manor and Laurel Hills were added. It contains Spring Creek, wetlands, and floodplain areas. It also contains areas of steep slopes of 15% or more. The open space tract, that 17.4 acre property, contains 3 residential units as well as farm structures and uses. And the residential lots currently have no formal established use and could be sold and developed with residential uses at any time.
Okay.
So these properties, as I mentioned, were in an open space rural clustering development and basically consist of 2 large residential lots with an open space lot. This map here shows the properties outlined in red along with the surrounding land uses, or at least what the surrounding properties can be used for in terms of land use. It's adjacent to other large lot residential uses as well as open space developments such as Laurel Hills to the south, as well as to a recreational resort, which is the Mountain View Country Club there to the west. It's located within the growth boundary, and the existing uses were consistent with the purpose and intent of the rural residential area. So looking at the rural residential area that was defined by the Planning Commission, the uses that the Planning Commission envisioned in this area, these properties are consistent with that vision. And then this map here, I think, illustrates what the request was from Mr. Yoakum. So the map on the left shows just Mr. Yoakum's properties labeled as A. And then in order to have this included, there would need to be other properties included in order to truly avoid a very obvious spot zoning if we were to just to make A agricultural. So representative of Hunt Ridge Manor stated that they would like to see their open space and stormwater parcel, which is labeled as B, brought into the new agricultural district. And the property owner of C, which I believe is Galen Drybulbus, also submitted a letter to the township voicing his support for having his property included in the new agricultural district. So this just gives you an overview of what would need to take place in order for the Yoakum parcels to be included within the agricultural district. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context. Does anyone have any questions for me at all on the Yoakum properties?
I have some questions.
Sure.
First of all, on the drive, that little triangular piece, that is the way your map is now, that is proposed to be in agricultural. Is that correct?
No. So this map shows the existing or the proposed zoning districts. So all of these properties that are outlined in red on the right are all in the rural residential district as proposed.
Okay, well, one of your drawings was confusing to me. It looks like property C was included in ag.
It might have been this one here. It's shown as yellow because it could only be used for residential uses because it's too small to be used for anything else. If that might be where the confusion is. But,
Okay. And then my only other question is, one of your earliest slides showed some of the high value farmlands. Does that extend into this at all?
so you're referring to the agricultural soils, prime agricultural soils?
Yes. Mhm.
I think there are some prime agricultural soils on the property. I don't know the percentage of the lot that consists of them. But I believe there are some portions of the property that definitely have some prime ag soils. I just don't know how much.
And these are currently, all these properties, green and red in the current slide, are currently zoned agriculture.
Right, they're in our current agricultural district. Again, thinking back to the designated rural areas project, it really was it was envisioning new districts altogether. So while the name agriculture is still being kept as part of the district, it really is a new district with.
Yeah. Mark, are there any other points of information or edification you're preparing tonight, or presenting tonight?
Yeah, so I think the last thing I just wanted to go over real quick was the request from the Board of Supervisors is essentially for the Planning Commission to review the proposed zoning map and the methodology that was used to develop the boundaries, and then to determine if these properties should be included in the agricultural district, and also if there are other properties that are, if all the other properties are located in the appropriate rural district and area. So I think from a staff's perspective, probably the most important thing first is for the Planning Commission to decide whether or not you agree with the methodology that was used back in 2014 and 2015 to come up with these rural areas. And then if you do, I think there's a couple options that we would recommend that might be possibilities for moving forward. If you agree with the findings of the methodology and the outcomes, the proposed rural rezoning could ultimately be forwarded back to the board for potential action. And you may want to look at making some changes to the district boundaries based on recent development. These areas were outlined back in 2014 and 2015. There's certainly been some development since that time. So it may make sense to look at expanding or contracting some districts. In particular, I'm thinking of the Mountain View Estates development along Windmill Road. There were the kind of across from the Hess Field area. That's a perfect example of an open space development that was completed after all of this planning was done. If the Planning Commission believes that there were some type of errors made in applying this methodology, certainly that should be noted, what those errors are, and revisions could be recommended to the zoning map that is supported by clear and reasonable justifications. And then ultimately, I think if the Planning Commission feels that the methodology was flawed, we'd have to have you identify a new methodology, and that would certainly require substantial rewrite, I think, of what is being proposed. So I think ultimately, though, it's probably important for the Planning Commission first to decide if you agree with the methodology that was used, and then give staff some direction on what you're going to need next month to move forward with the second part of the analysis. And that is all I had to say this evening. So hopefully that give everybody a good background, and I'd be happy to again answer any questions or take any comments.
Mark, one of the things that's I'd like to note is that, and I don't know that I may have missed you, but the regional growth boundary was one of the primary considerations of how we defined that boundary for the regional or for rural residential. Right. So we felt that anything that was in the the regional growth boundary would be a prime candidate to stay have some residential component to it. So that was one of the primary drivers. So when you look at that, the map, and you see that these areas are all within the regional growth boundary, I think that's one level of consistency that we have.
I don't even know if it was reflected in the minutes, but I do believe early on, Bob, there was even discussion of not including them in a rural district altogether. Some of these,
Right.
Some of these large rural developments, I think the thought was maybe having a new district for all of that land in the growth boundary.
Yep.
Okay.
But
Thank you, Bob.
And Bob, I think the methodology was solid. And most everything that we've worked on since then has used that same sort of thought process to figure out what the best use for the land is. So I would be concerned that if we find fault in what was done then, the chances of somebody questioning everything we've done in the 4 years since then is greatly increased.
Thank you both for those comments. Mark, I think you've laid out the situation here pretty succinctly. There is some cartography ahead of us, I believe, no matter where we go, is to look at boundaries, look at maps. It's not just this corner of the township, it's the whole mapping. And that I know is ahead of us. Amy, you say we have some questions or comments from the public. Why don't we hear those at this time, and then hear what else planning commission members or staff have to question or comment, please.
Okay, Mr. Rittenhouse, I'm gonna let you join the party because you had your hand up. So if you unmute yourself, you can talk.
Thank you. I have two questions. Mark, I kind of lost track. I just kind of lost it just for a second on the 10-acre site discussion you had. You required 50% of open space. So if you have a 100-acre site and you did all 10-acre sites, you still need open space at that point?
No, not under our current regulations. If you are going to do 10-acre properties under our current agricultural district, they're considered agricultural lots. So when I'm referring to those open space rural clustering regulations, I'm referring to what's currently adopted.
Okay. That's where I kind of lost it for a bit. Anyway, the other question I have just on churches and other places of worship that are listed, would that also include religious schools that belong to the church? Could they be incorporated in the same parcel or separate parcels?
Well, I might actually defer to Mr. Shea on that. I don't know if we have a separate definition for religious schools, if it would be considered a school use or a church use.
Yeah, I think in the past, when we've talked about things like this, if the school is part of a church and it can be shown that it is a use customarily accessory to a church, it's more likely that it could occur there than just as a school. I think if there's no church component to the use there, and the church component is not the primary use of the property, I think zoning would consider it a school, and a school would have to be the permitted primary use in that district.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Does anyone else from the public want to say anything? Just raise your electronic hand, please. I'm not seeing anyone. Oh, Scott Yoakum does. Hold on, Scott, I'm coming. All right, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mark. I think that was a good presentation. It helped me out a lot, number one. Number two, at the last supervisors meeting, I provided, and I'm going to use the word, a chart or a spreadsheet. And I think that'd be beneficial for the Planning Commission and the supervisors for the current ag definition and regulations and uses, along with the new proposed agricultural regulations in the rural residential. So I'm going to look at Amy, Todd, and Mark. As you pointed out last time, Mark, at the supervisors, that chart only included the current ag that I compared to the rural residential. And my bad, I did forget the proposed ag uses. So I think that could be beneficial to all as you're putting this together. And Bob Igo mentioned about being in the growth boundary. And I think we're referring to the 14, 15 acre triangle up Tusseyville Road that belongs to Jeff Biddle. He has the 125 acre farm, whatever he has, that is in the growth boundary that should be considered probably RR, rural residential, because he could still farm it any way he wants agriculturally for that reason. And in reference to my request and Hunt Ridge Manor and Galen Dravelbis, everything to the east where it touches the Nittany farm, the old Dravelbis piece, that farm is all agricultural over there. And I do agree with Mark's comment that if you just took my 17 acres and made it ag, that is spot zoning. And I think we got to look, and I think it was, correct me, Amy, Supervisor Frank,
Pardon.
thank you, who requested an overall view of looking at the entire map of all these pieces, because that piece, along with Somerset Drive, a cul-de-sac with 3 parcels, 2 are to be in the rural residential, and the 1 is still an ag on the same cul-de-sac. So those are some of the details to work out, but I just wanted everybody to understand. And I think it's a big key to put all the uses in the current ag, future ag, and rural residential, so everybody can compare what we have or don't have in the uses. That would be beneficial for all, but I'm still requesting that the 3 tracks, in fact, Amy may have shared with you a letter that was sent by my attorney, Louis Glantz. I don't know, time flies, Amy, here, 7 to 10 days ago, that we'd like it to stay in agricultural, but the other solution or proposal was that if it were to go in RR, rural residential zoning, is that any tract that has 10 acres or more that is enrolled in the clean and green and the ag security area would have the same regulations as the agricultural area. So instead of the rural, anything over 10 acres would fall under the ag definition, and even if it's the new ag definition. So that's just something else to consider down the road also. That's all I have. I was trying to work out a win-win for all, and Mark, I think that was a very good presentation tonight. One of the best I've seen, even though I've only been here for I've been here for 17 years, but with working through this. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Those are really helpful high points to address, and some comparisons to tighten up a little bit as we move through this. Appreciate your help.
Does anyone else in the public have a comment? Please raise your electronic hand. I'm not seeing anyone else. George Harrigan has his real hand up.
Yep.
Mark, if I may, just for a moment. There's a detail I've heard a couple of times through the various meetings we've been involved with this, that I'm trying to figure out the significance of it, but it's been mentioned on a couple of occasions that subdivision work that had been done ahead of Mr. Yoakum's owning the properties preclude them from being further subdivided or combined.
That's correct. So the plan that was recorded in 2001 had a prohibition on being further subdivided. That's also consistent with our open space rural clustering regulations. And speaking with our solicitor, he stated that, subdivision includes combining lots. That is a subdivision to reconstitute them all as one.
That's my understanding. And that those provisions are enforced currently and are planned to be enforced going forward. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And then also part and parcel to that question is that direct access to the property from 322 is prohibited. What does that mean? Since that road goes from the properties right onto 322.
Right. That means that those properties are only permitted to utilize that private street to access 322. They're not allowed to have a second driveway coming off of them onto 322. I imagine that access was limited to the private street just because of it being 322 and safety concerns.
So that it's labeled as I think Mount Nittany Drive or something like that.
Nittany Meadow Farm Lane, I believe.
Oh, okay, my mistake. Is that a driveway or a road?
It's a private street. It's a private street.
So it's something in between the two?
Well, it's a private street, meaning that it has to be built to certain township standards. And then in the future, if property owners were to agree, it could always be transferred over to township ownership and become a public street. But at this point, it's just a private street. So it's responsibility for maintaining it is shared by the property owners. And there's a limitation on the number of lots that can be accessed from the private street based on our regulations.
And is that accessible for public access to the properties?
I
would be,
unless they're going to restrict the public from utilizing it. I think people are welcome to drive up, but I'm not certain, Todd, if you have any more to say. I mean, we can't restrict private access or public access, I don't think, to a private street, but
no, the zoning regulations, currently do, if a subdivision was proposed today, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if this subdivision was proposed today, the zoning regulations would limit the number of daily trips on a private cul-de-sac street. And I think it limits it to 50.
Yes.
The Kissel subdivision that you're talking about, George, was done many, many years prior to that regulation being in effect. So there is no zoning prohibition on trip numbers on this particular private street.
Oh, Harvey Hamlin has his hand up. Chris, if you want to.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Harvey, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. For those of you, I've been on the last number of meetings. I represent the Hutton Ridge Manors Homeowner Association. And when we take a look at it, and one of the concerns that I know that at the last meeting with the supervisors, when Mr. Finelli was there, the solicitor, we talked about the methodology and spot zoning. The methodology is, I don't think there's any issue with the methodology, but one of the issues that Mark, you brought up, and it was there, was the idea of maintaining agriculture as much as you can within the plan. And it's one thing that the supervisors said last week, that if we can maintain as much agriculture as we can and still not in any way affect, I live in a home on Hutton Ridge Manor. I'm in a residential area. The property I'm talking about with Hutton Ridge, of course, is that 17+ acre retention area we have that butts up to 322. So when I look at the map, and the last map you had, which separated the Kissel vis-a-vis Yoakum property, and then all of the properties along that side of 322, to me, even if you made those agricultural, you're not changing the methodology at all. All you're doing is taking properties and saying that part of those properties can remain agricultural. I don't know if there's a consistency on the other side of 322 that you did the same thing, because there are properties there that are remaining agricultural that maybe should have been in rural residential. And so I don't think the methodology is the issue. I think the mapping is the issue. And I don't think it's inconsistent at all by considering that those properties that are contiguous with each other to maintain an agricultural. Thank you.
I would suggest that the methodology is changed if you take property that the designated rural area project recommended be rural residential and simply change it to agricultural based upon the information that Mark just presented. The information that Mark presented showed that the Planning Commission consistently recommended that properties that were developed for smaller lot development for residential development should all be grouped together. The rural clustering development should be grouped together in the same zoning district. So that methodology indicates that the Yoakum former Kissel properties should be included in rural residential. That's the conclusion drawn by that methodology. So simply saying, let's change a map line and let's not worry about the methodology is a change to the methodology.
Kent Baker has his hand up next.
So I was going to ask, well, first of all, I'm just going to comment that I think the methodology that Mark presented tonight was very solid, and I completely agree with it. I was wondering if you would be able to display the proposed rural residential district just while we're discussing this.
Let me get this here. I'm not as fast at pulling this up.
Because I mean, was proposed at the supervisor meeting and kind of talked about again tonight was two proposed options to satisfy the Yoakum request. One was to include, the agri-tainment uses in the RR district, which I think would be very dangerous to do, and I wanted to kind of look at some of that because I think even the Biddle property off of Main Street is in this RR district. Am I looking at that correct or not? It's hard.
No, that's zoned single family residential actually.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't know. I just see a danger in that. That's one option to consider, but I see some dangers with allowing, because I generally, their methodology is saying it's primarily for a rural residential type development and not primarily agriculture. So from that standpoint, I don't really think that agri-tainment uses should be in the RR district. And the other thing they're talking about was obviously doing what I would call a little bit of gerrymandering of that line to go through Hunt Ridge Manor and up into the Yoakum property. Which you could do, but given that the Hunt Ridge property is considered, part of Hunt Ridge, it made total sense to include that in the RR district. So, and that was the only other thing I was a little fearful of was when I was hearing the discussions from the supervisors that they were thinking about granting this request, that they at least remove the stormwater basin, which I believe is above Spring Creek, from that request, because I think I mentioned it the last time, I definitely see a danger with including a stormwater basin for a subdivision in a different district than the proposed district. So that was my main thing that I was trying to present at the last two meetings. So, and I'm going to reiterate that again. But in general, I think the methodology is solid, and I think in general, from what I see, the mapping's solid too. And I guess we can talk about that in more detail at a later meeting. You mentioned something about some of the properties off of Shingletown Road, but I'm just generally in agreement with what you got so far.
Thank you. These comments and questions are really helpful. We, I think, have anticipated a deeper dive into actual looking at boundaries and mapping at a subsequent meeting, I understand, Amy, is that the plan here?
Yeah, we would do that next month because we figured, and I'm glad that we did the deep dive into the methodology this month and we're not trying to do it all in one meeting. Picking up Mr. Yoakum's suggestion, what we will also do is we will provide that chart for you that shows the current ag regulations, the proposed ag regulations, proposed rural residential regulations, and then also, because I think this is very important and germane to this topic, what you're allowed to do, the uses allowed on the open space rural clustering regulations, because that is the limiting factor, right, for these properties, not so much that they're going to be zoned rural residential, it's that they're developed under the open space rural clustering, which is slightly different in terms of what you're allowed to do.
Yeah. Let's also explore Mr. Yoakum's idea to look into properties that are over 10 acres. If it was to change with the clean and green and ag security area, what kind of arrangement might be made there? Maybe none. Maybe there's a possibility. But let's look at that too, please.
Yes, we can do that.
Are there other comments or questions? This is a historical, has some history here, has some background, and has some important ramifications moving forward. So it's good we're taking a look at this and doing it with care. Any other comments or questions here tonight?
Mark, can you make this PowerPoint presentation available to us, please?
I will send out a PDF version to everyone. Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, seeing no other hands raised, questions. I think we've gotten a good start here, and more to come the third Monday of May. And in between, there will be some homework, I would anticipate. Okay, let's move on, please. To reports from Amy and George, and anything with zoning permits. Let's start with zoning permits. Will there be any for us to review at the township office?
Todd's muted.
Yes, there should be. I think March's zoning permits sitting on my desk yet, trying to find the time to do the report, but I can probably get that done sometime this week.
So maybe look to come in next week to review those and sign off on them as early as next week.
Sure.
Okay, great.
I can make a brief report. On April 1st, there was a joint meeting of the Public Services and Environmental Transportation and Land Use Committees with the Center Region Planning Commission. During this meeting, the group recommended to designate May as Bike Month. So not just bike to work, but bike month. And so with the area being designated as more bicycle friendly, this was adopted. And so you may see some materials in the community about that. The group also received multiple presentations about current issues and potential opportunities. And the summary of this meeting is still forthcoming. And so you can expect to see that in a more summary fashion shortly, but it has not been distributed yet. That is all. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Amy. Any questions for Amy on Center Region Planning or comments? George, technical committee, please.
Yeah, I can give you guys a brief report. There was a meeting on the 14th of April with it turned out to be fairly lengthy, but it included topics regarding pending issues out of the 2020 census, where the there are changes to the urban and urbanized definitions that have been put forth. In fact, even methodology for defining such districts. It's yet to be seen how those will affect boundaries within the region, but it likely will. There's concern about federalizing some rules and definitions surrounding suburban areas that might come out of the finalization of the 2020 census as well. Then there was some discussion about projects underway, some updates that we were provided with regarding the intersection at 26 and 45. It looks like that's going to be going out for bid this August. There's expected some shovels to the ground very, very late in 21, and hopeful completion of the changes that'll be made there in late 22. There'll be the addition of a signal there and road realignment that's consistent with the new signaling. Also updates on the South Atherton pending work. Looks like it'll be taking place not until 2022, late spring of 2022, and scheduled to go through 2024. So we'll all enjoy that, I'm sure. And then an update on the high-speed interchange work, which isn't expected to start until 23, but will be a 3 or 4 year project. A lot of discussion about the Pathways Initiative. That's the PEL that they're undertaking to look at new kinds of funding mechanisms to supplement or replace the gas taxes. A lot of talk about toll roads, potential for toll roads, potential for corridor pricing, possibly charges per mile per gallon charge, miles traveled charges. A lot of theoretical conceptual discussion, but they need lots of money. So it's going to be an interesting Pell project that to see where that goes, and results from that are due later this year. And that's a large group out of Harrisburg running that show. And that's and the safety subcommittee had another meeting, and we went back to them with a few more questions for more information regarding intersection and segment traffic issues. But that wraps that up.
Thank you, George. I have a question regarding the 2645 interchange out there near Pine Grove Mills. Amy's going to love this. It's probably way too late since it's going out to bid, but was there any talk about a traffic circle there?
Oh God, yes.
There had been. I think at this point that part of the design is rejected, and it was decided that they'll do it with signaling.
Yeah, boneheaded in my view.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I've been in New Jersey and New England, so I know where that goes.
Sorry, I just want to get that out there. Okay, Amy, you want to roll us through recent actions by the Board of Supervisors, please?
Sure. They approved the Raleigh subdivision component 1 planning module. They had actually approved that last month, but it was rejected by DEP, so it had to come back and they reapproved it. They designated May as Bike to Work Month, May 17th through the 23rd as Bike to Work Week, and May 21st, I believe, is Bike to Work Day. And they also approved Ordinance 347, which is the accessory solar energy system regulations. So yeah, that's what they did. And then obviously the rural stuff.
Right, right. Well, thanks to staff and planning commission members for getting that accessory solar energy system regulation through. That was great that moved ahead. Well done. Great. Any other comments before we wrap up tonight or questions? Been a long meeting. Thanks for hanging in there. Okay. Who wants the motion that we close this thing?
I make the motion to adjourn the meeting for this evening.
I will second that.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.